this week, we're continuing our series on undeserved royal reputations. Now, you may have seen our previous episode on Richard the Lionheart, and today I'm going to examine Richard II. Megalomaniacal, tyrannical, vain, and an all-round bad king. Well, he might have been all those things, but I'm not convinced. And like Richard the Lionheart before him, and Richard III after him, this King Richard has a lot more to the story than meets the eye. In many ways, he's quite an interesting monarch. Now, the first thing to understand about Richard II is that he wasn't supposed to be king. The trouble was, his father, Edward the Black Prince, was supposed to be king, and he was everything that a country currently in the middle of the 100 Years' War needed. But he died in 1376, and Richard's brother, Edward of Angoulême, who was supposed to be heir, had died in 1370, which left Richard as the heir to Edward III's throne. Because he wasn't the firstborn as well, he was a spare that had become an heir. And we have a checkered past with those. Then, to make matters worse, Edward III died in 1377 and left Richard in charge of the country at 10 years old. And this was a country in a war that would last another 50 years. Now, because 10-year-olds just aren't allowed to run countries, he was supported by a council of regents, and this had effectively replaced one person who wasn't supposed to be king for a few years with a group of 12 nobles who were not supposed to be king at all. Throw in one powerful uncle in the form of John of Gaunt and things are not going to go well. If there's one thing Plantagenets cannot make a success of, it's a powerful uncle. Now, for my money, I'm just not convinced that Richard was as tyrannical as history portrays him. I just don't think he was that good at the job. I mean, he does have his moments, but in the grand scheme of things, the grand Game of Thrones, he plays and he loses, and that's when harsh things happen. We think of the Tudor court as the ultimate historical dangerous viper pit, but to be honest, the Plantagenet court is equally as brutal. In the Plantagenet court, losing kings get killed, whereas in the Tudor court, the court kills everyone else but the king. But the danger is pretty much the same. But I digress. So, getting back to the early reign of Richard II, the government is being done by a series of continual councils, which feature pretty much all the factional infighting and family enrichment that goes along with this oh-so-Norman type of government. In terms of actually improving England, it wasn't really going anywhere. The 100 Years' War was not going well at all, and far from the grand sweeping lands of France that both Edward's father, grandfather and further ancestors could boast, all England had at this time was Calais and a part of the Gascony coastline stretching from Bordeaux to Bayonne. So whatever these 12 nobles are doing so far, it isn't working. Now, Richard's principal tutor was a man named Sir Simon Burley. He was a close friend of the family, and he encouraged Richard to restore the glory of the English throne through assertion of his personal authority and royal prerogative. And we see a great example of this in his approach to the Peasants' Revolt. Now, for a quick guide to the Peasants' Revolt, and I do mean a quick guide, with the Black Death having wiped out 1/3 of medieval Europe, good labourers are in short supply, and that meant they could demand higher pay, higher wages, or go looking elsewhere for work. Unfortunately, the system of serfdom prevents this. That ties people to the land in a kind of indentured service. It's almost like paid slavery. So although these workers were paid, they weren't free, and they couldn't go and look for higher wages. They had basically to put up with whatever they were given. This, combined with an ever-increasing burden of taxation culminating in the third poll tax in 1381, sparked a riot in Kent, closely followed by an armed insurrection that swept through the south of England. Now, Richard met these rebels at Smithfield, and an altercation broke out with the revolt leader, Wat Tyler, being killed by the Mayor of London. Because the Mayor of London really knew how to kick ass them days. Richard then advanced into the armed crowd and calmed the situation down, leading the remaining rebels out of the area. Now, when Richard faced down these rebels, he was 14 years old. And it was less of a confrontation than we think. I mean, Richard had already agreed to the demands of the rebels, particularly in lines with the abolition of serfdom. And we may consider that he was lying. It's a possibility, but you'd have to have a pretty impressive poker face to pull off that lie in front of an armed and angry crowd that had just hacked to death the Archbishop of Canterbury. It's more likely that he agreed with the demands, but once the rebellion had petered out, that government dragged its heels. Now, the pardons that he offered to the revolters were revoked 2 weeks later. It's unclear at this stage whether this was the plan from the start or not. However, either way, this isn't the behaviour of a tyrant, and this is the point. Tyrants work on the principle of they are right and everyone else can go hang. So the tyrant Richard would likely have just kept killing rebels until they surrendered. He would be doing hangings, he would be doing executions, he would be making an absolute example of these people. Whether that turned out to be a good idea or not, compliance with the rebels, even faked compliance, is just not the tyrant way. There are other elements of Richard's reign that are often pointed to when considering him to be a tyrant, and that is his rewarding of his favourites at court, in particular in this case Robert de Vere, the 9th Earl of Oxford, whom Richard made the Justice of Chester and the Duke of Ireland, quite powerful roles. Also Michael de la Pole, who had been made Earl of Suffolk and Chancellor, and of course this gets right up the nose of other nobles like the Earl of Warwick, the Earl of Nottingham, John of Gaunt's own son, the Earl of Derby, Henry Bolingbroke. Well, the thing is, call me cynical, but this is just what monarchs and politicians do. Henry VIII did it, Elizabeth I did it, William the Conqueror did it. It's a monarch thing, and it still goes on today. They promote people that they like, and they keep out people that they don't, even if the people they're keeping out might actually be good at their job. That's just not the way these things ever run. This isn't tyranny. This is just normal politics. Now, in response, these overlooked nobles banded together to form a faction known as the Lords Appellant, and they confronted the king and they forced the removal of de la Pole as Chancellor, forced de Vere to flee the country, and had others loyal to the king executed. Now, this does look tyrannical to me, but in fact, it's the Lords Appellant that are the tyrants here. Richard just appears to be rubbish at politics, which is a hallmark of those who come to the throne at an early age without actually growing up within that environment. Now, he would go further in annoying the rest of his nobility by coming to peace terms with the French. This went down very well with the commons and the people, the ones that do the actual fighting and dying. But of course it meant that those fighting nobles like Gaunt and so forth no longer had a darn good war to make themselves richer and more powerful. So, up to now, Richard has agreed to the demands of rebels, excluded people he didn't like, caved to another group of rebels, and made peace to end a long and unnecessary war. I'm not seeing tyranny all over the place here, are you? But if you do want to see tyranny, the closest we can get to it then is we are looking at the last 2 years of Richard's reign. This is the time most historians refer to as the tyranny of Richard. Richard has the Duke of Gloucester and the Earls of Arundel and Warwick, the main Lords Appellant, arrested. We're not entirely sure why, but given that they'd been part of pretty much every plot and hassle against Richard for the entirety of his reign, it's probably not without cause. But the thing is, if he's that tyrannical, then why wait 10 years to take revenge on them? Again, it just sounds less despotic when you think that. Arundel was executed, Gloucester died before reaching trial, Warwick was to be imprisoned for the remainder of his life, Bolingbroke was exiled to France for life. Finally, the problem is solved. But in 1399, when John of Gaunt died, Henry Bolingbroke, his son, returned to claim the lands that were his by inheritance. But given that these lands had been seized by the crown, if he wanted them back, he was going to have to do it by force. And that's what he did. Bolingbroke invaded, Richard was caught off guard, ill-prepared, and without an army. Meeting little resistance, Bolingbroke accepted the surrender of Richard and agreed to spare his life if he abdicated the throne. Henry Bolingbroke was crowned Henry IV on the 13th of October 1399. Now, deposing a king is a big deal, especially when you're basically doing it to get your estates back, so Henry needed a better reason than his vast tracts of land. And what better reason than doing his sacred duty to the realm by removing a tyrannical despot? In short, Henry needed Richard to be the tyrant that history has since painted him. Remember, history is written by the winners. And then Shakespeare would go on to make it somewhat worse, possibly because he needed to create a bigger tyrant than Elizabeth I. Who knows? Richard is said to have been starved to death in the oubliette of Pontefract Castle, from the French word oublier, to forget. The metal door you can see here covers the entrance to that dungeon today. Richard was, in many ways, a bad king. He was probably vain, he was possibly mentally ill, he was almost certainly useless in terms of political nous. But was he really a cruel, vindictive and irresponsible tyrant? I'm not convinced. If you compare him to William the Conqueror, or Henry VIII, or any one of the Tudor monarchs, and he's a pussycat by comparison. So let's slate him for the things he actually was, which was possibly the worst Plantagenet. And that in itself is an achievement. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.